Welcome to episode 9 of Out of Bounds, the podcast where I give my social commentary on different topics in today's society. I'm your host, Terry, and today, talking about toxic masculinity. Now, when I first started having these conversations, I definitely had one idea, but going through these conversations, processing it all, I've come to a totally different conclusion about the whole discussion with masculinity and femininity. But where it started, I would say, is that whenever I heard this discussion about toxic masculinity, I would always question the person, like, what about toxic femininity? And no one's talking about that. Why don't we bring it up? And I don't mean that as a way to change the conversation or to distract, but as a way to look at the full perspective, that of the conversation, because these are two things that go hand in hand. And so my biggest issue is that whenever people talk about toxic masculinity, it became inherently anti-male, and I didn't feel comfortable with that. So I think some people do cross the line and blur the lines with being anti-male and being anti-toxic masculinity. And sometimes in the conversations don't really know where those lines are. But for the most part, I just think it's easy to fall into that when you're talking about characteristics and conversations that historically pertain to men. And so my issue is that it was becoming kind of this mantra that men are the problem. And that's definitely not the case. So, when you're talking about toxic masculinity, which a lot of people can't even define correctly, but understanding that that is a concept that deals with the idea of what men are as far as a gender role. And toxic masculinity is when people are really strict with that type of role. And so that can then, perpetrate and produce these stereotypes of what a man should be and how they should act, what they can and can't do, and vice versa, what a woman should be and what she can and can't do. And so the conversation is that those type of ideas can have very negative effects. So I agree with that part. I do agree that if you take these ideas of gender roles that we created in society and you overemphasize it, or you become too narrow and rigid and not flexible with it, then there's definitely negative consequences. But my thing was, there's also the exact same conversation on the other side with toxic femininity and what it means to be a woman, what a woman can't do and should do. And there's people that have that as well. And so since that was being absent in the conversation, I think it inherently sounded anti-male, and it might have, without meaning to, created this idea that women are inherently perfect or better, or, the angels, the good guys in this, or the good people in this conversation. So, of course, neither of those are true, but I think some people get swept up in that. Now, what I will say is that going through this conversation, it occurred to me that we don't need the masculine feminine spectrum. And I talked before about genders, and I do believe it's two genders. You're born a male or female. Some people are born intersex. But we talked about gender as far as people trying to change that because it was socially constructed of what you should and shouldn't be. And so I don't think that's really the answer. I don't think creating a bunch of new genders is the answer. I don't think you say, I'm a woman, but I like doing this, so I'm a man now. I don't think that doesn't make sense. What does make sense to me is that we don't need to label things masculine and feminine. That was something we did as a society. As humans, we like to compartmentalize information, make it easier, and that's something we did. So if you like working on a car and fixing cars, why does that have to be a masculine thing? If you like wearing dresses, that doesn't have to strictly be a feminine thing. Well, yeah. So I feel like, the real conversation is about getting rid of that spectrum because it doesn't serve us. Again, we created as a society to make it easier for information, but I think it doesn't serve us really anymore, especially as we come to an understanding that people can do whatever it is they want. And so I still think it works to say, okay, I'm a woman, but I'm a masculine woman. The things I like to do is masculine. Easy enough to understand. But I just don't think that even needs to be said. You're a woman and you like to do what you like to do. You're a man, you like to do what you like to do. And it's as simple as that. Because these actions, activities, these character traits, they aren't inherent in us. So we talk about love in sports and you attribute it as a masculine trait that men have, but you're not born with that. And so all these things people kind of bring up, being violent, competitive, protective, all that, those are traits that can be in anybody. And so I think so long in our society that we attributed these with men and women that we just kind of ingrain it and we cross the line of understanding that this isn't something you're born with. It's something you're taught. And so I think the real conversation, as I said, is getting rid of that spectrum because there's things that are inherent biologically with being a male or a female, but that's about it. There's no, characteristics, as far as personality that are inherent in you because you're born a male or a female. So I just don't see the need for us to have feminine and masculine anymore. And so I do think it could be toxic to be too rigid with anything. But at the same time, I just think that if we get rid of the spectrum, a lot of that confusion and issues is alleviated. I mean, yeah, we're trained up in that way and we've been trained up in that way. But I think as you break it down and you start to move away from it, I think it'll be a lot easier for people in society to roll with the conversations. And then you realize that the conversations is about individuals. It's not about like concepts that we created. The issue isn't really about masculinity. It isn't really about men. It's not really about women. It's about individuals and the way they process information and handle the world. And so we've gotten to this place where everything is about the systems and the concepts and all these ideologies, and everything that happens, we're going to trace it back and blame it on some. And those factors exist. They contribute to everything. But I think we just left the individual out of it. So now we just keep having these discussions about the structures and the powers and the systems and the ideas. And we never talk about the individual because that's what breathes life into all these things, are working individuals. I think if we work on bettering individuals in our mindsets, then inherently we'll start to change the structures and whatnot. But that's a larger conversation. So I think there's a way you get rid of this masculine feminine thing and we just kind of go on and let people live life. And then toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, it really just then becomes a conversation about a person and how they choose to interact with the world. So those are my thoughts on it anyway. So go to the comment section. Let me know what you think. Share it around. Get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe. And until next episode.